Hey folks, Layman Pascal here, once again on the Integral Stages author series where we explore, promote, and chew our way through the liminal edges of books and other writing projects that emerge from or pertain to the integrative, transformative, developmental, and regenerative culture that exists or needs to exist. Today, with absolutely no irony, I'm sitting down with the author of Gurdjieff for A Time Between Worlds, a new book from Sky Meadow Press about the sly, complex, difficult, and inadequately examined early 20th century wisdom teacher and existential development expert G.I. Gurdjieff, who gave birth to the so-called Fourth Way and what they call the work. Who was he? Where did he come from? What does his teaching still hold for us, distinct from other streams of Dharma and existential development as we move ever more deeply into the age of the meta-crisis? I'm very happy to be joined today by, wait a minute, this has to be a mistake, by me, Layman Pascal.
That's right. Hi, Layman. Good to be here.
This is actually a bit confusing. How can we be the same person?
We're not exactly the same person. I clearly have different facial hair and a different shirt on.
Okay, that's true, I suppose.
Plus, this sort of acts out one aspect of the individual nature of the self.
What is a dividual?
Well, it's a word that's become common in metamodern and liminal communities. It refers to the functional non-individuality of the human unit. We are plural and interconnected in many ways. We co-construct ourselves with the other, even from the most primal layer of being. We live as part of a network, regardless of what the habits of atomized modern culture might entrain us to believe. And importantly, we are a symphony of selves. We are neurologically and psychologically plural beings. The old Gurdjieffians might describe this as a fragmented condition that needs to be unified. In contemporary language, we might say that our lives of inner experience are tasked with generating a better quality of teamwork among our disparate partial selves, and that the cohesion, the functional interconnection and orchestration of these parts is that quality by which our greater capacities of action and understanding become available in the world. The individual.
To me, it sounds a little bit like postmodern talk to describe this non-individual nature of the self, but the subtitle of your book is Hyperpersonal Essays on the Grandfather of Metamodern Spirituality. How do you square that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is not an academic tome, nor is it meant to simply replicate the types of common introductions to Gurdjieff that one finds in many 20th century books, or in the Wikipedia world that's only heard a few vague things about self-remembering and people being robots. It's not that kind of a book. It's hyper personal, meaning it comes from me. It's channeled through my personal relationship to Gurdjieff and the parts of his work that have and continue to be the most meaningful to me. And I call him the grandfather of metamodern spirituality, firstly because he has a grandfatherly relationship projected and stipulated in his magnum opus, The Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson, and which in part looks beyond his immediate students to those who come later, to those who come now and in the future. And you probably know that I've been doing a lot of work to seed the notion of an eldership transmission culture within the liminal webs. But all of that brings us to the metamodern spirituality part. I call it metamodern spirituality firstly, in homage to the fact that it was created to be the first volume from Sky Meadow Press, where we hold the seasonal Metamodern Spirituality Labs, and because this book is part of a conversation between the leading cultural sensibility and the perennial need for human transformation and growth through the use of psychotechnologies and special community spaces. In this kind of a realm, people are expected to be at least postmodern, at least capable of resonating with plurality and intercontextuality and ecology and irony and the unknown status of collectively evolved truths and the manifold shifting nature of psyches and paradigms. That's a threshold that has to be crossed, a set of truths that have to be assimilated into heart and body, but it's not the end. You can move on from there into a vibe a community, a practice of moving between and struggling between and feeling between and generating new stability and coherence between the alterities, between our oscillating capacities to take different perspectives, and an unfolding sense of service to the culture that can do that, and the people and the visions that emerge as hybrid structures of understanding and depth and new interaction on the far shore of relativism, nihilism, and pluralism. I think that's what a word like metamodern is pointing to, and that's clearly something that's embedded in and embodied in Gurdjieff's approach and in the models he generates, even though he himself would never, you know, identify himself as any kind of faddish philosophical and cultural movement.
So you are a Gurdjieffian?
Well, I love Gurdjieff. I mean, I include in this book near the beginning a comment made to Margaret Anderson, who was hesitating to write her own very personal and idiosyncratic introduction to this man and his teachings. And one of her elders simply told her that she was qualified to make the attempt because she was in favor of him. I'm in favor of him. I've spent time with people and groups of formal Gurdjieffians. There's a great deal of diversity among them. I am not a formal member of any fourth way lineage. I do not represent the Gurdjieff Foundation. I love the idiosyncratic non-lineal pretenders just as much as I love Gurdjieffian traditionalists. I am a Gurdjieffian outlier, but I feel like we're entering a time of potential renaissance for this work, and that such a renaissance, which is needed by the world, requires a reconciliation and a lively reconsolidation of the different streams, instantiations, and flavors of the work in all of their various mutations. From my point of view, the teaching is not available only through special formal lineages, but most directly through Gurdjieff's specially designed and very interesting texts and principles of practice that he attempted to convey in the liminal spaces between different ways of engaging with his texts and with his biographical record.
What do you mean by different ways of engaging the texts?
Well, at the beginning of his writings, he gives this instruction to read them in at least three different ways. First, you try to read them as you would read and examine any kind of book, even any kind of spiritual text. Then you should go through it again, read it aloud, or as if you were reading aloud to someone. Bring in otherness, bring in voice, bring in the body and the breath. And only then, on the third rereading, start to try to fathom the structures that have been hidden in the text. So those are good instructions, but they are also, in my view, like all of his work, exemplary rather than merely propositional. So they stand for the idea that you should reread in different modes, in different states, in different stages. And through these efforts to bring different lenses and different affective valences to the text, you slowly start to find insights, perhaps insights very unique to you, insights that you can start to act on as a part of your life, and not just as some technique or affirmative spiritual belief you found in a book or heard in a community. Gurdjieff, actually has a very strong critique of ordinary literature, even very conventional spiritual and religious and transcendental communication. So it's important to attend to his instructions about the transmission of information. And one of the main ones is definitely bring in and pass through this text in multiple different modalities if you want any chance of finding the structures that are embedded in it rather than just the surface content of the material.
I want to get back to that because you have a very interesting appendix that starts to unpack his writing style and the theory of communication involved. But before we go there, and for people who have no clue what we're talking about, can you give us a bit of a background? Who is this guy?
Yeah, good question. Grigory Ivanovich Gurdjieff, or in a more playful English tone, we might say George Johnson Gurdjieff. There's a biographical section in this book, so you can read about it there. But very briefly, this was a highly creative Greco-Armenian spiritual teacher at the beginning of the 20th century. And unlike many spiritual teachers, he was very worldly. He spoke many languages. He'd lived and traveled in many countries. He was excellent at medicine and mechanical sciences and avant-garde art, and he was very funny. He has a thorough critique of language, a critique of modern culture, a critique of contemporary education systems, deeply ecological in his vision. One of the first people to talk about the need to combine Eastern and Western wisdom to deal with an emerging planetary crisis. He was surrealistic, he was heartful. He drew students who were not just bohemian seekers, but were impressive intellectuals, artists, philosophers from around the world, and he actively worked to keep them from getting into any kind of guru idolatry with him. He was a gourmet cook. He constantly evolved and modified his description of a regenerative mutual universe of co-creation in which human beings work to generate a more embodied integration between their different selves and lines of intelligence in our unfolding of a deeper quality of what he called being that is latent in what modern people would call their subconscious mind. He didn't try to convert people. He instead wanted people to make efforts to become capable of actually doing whatever kind of religion or non religion they're embedded to or drawn to. The emphasis on being able, on the power to do, is very important for him. Right? In his vision, we individually and collectively and in leading edge groups have a task within the biosphere and within the cosmos to move energy and information in certain ways that are accomplished by our existential development and by our deepening insight and our intentional inner struggles and our intersubjective peak experiences. I call him in the book basically a cross between Indiana Jones, Borat, and the Buddha, but armed with an integral meta theory and a regenerative biospheric vision, planetary sensibility, a sincerely ironic approach to communication, and an emphasis on being embodied and transformative in our understanding of ourselves and others beyond the limits of conscious left brain modalities. And from my point of view, all that's still pretty fucking relevant. In fact, the teaching of Gurdjieff, and this is something I want us to take really seriously, may not be specifically for the people who were with him in the 20s and 30s. It may be for people who still aren't even born yet. We may not even yet have met the purpose of Gurdjieff's teaching. It's dense and it's fresh and it's time released and it's not a dogma to hear and repeat. It's meant to evoke your inner living curriculum as a spiritually enabled complex human organism in a biosphere, in a solar system, in a cosmos. And I would call that, meta-modern, meta-shamanism for today and tomorrow.
So here's something I've heard debated about Gurdjieff. Was he a Christian?
It should be obvious to anyone interested in Gurdjieff that the answer can't be just yes or no. He grew up in a part of the world in late 19th century Armenia that had a lot of rich Christianity. So he's familiar with it, he's embedded in it, but he also embraced, entered, honored, and mocked many great and small styles of religious seeking, looking for the functional fragments of an older human wisdom about how we grow, how we transform, and what our role is in the complex symbiosis of multidimensional natural systems. He told some people that the approach could be called esoteric Christianity, but it seems like he was pointing to the esoteric element in every religion and also to his personal observation that many of the most important things about Christianity are far older than the pseudo historical life of Jesus.
What do you mean honored and mocked?
Yeah, he believed in insults. He was very progressive, but not in a politically correct kind of way. He seemed to believe that you should, if you have the opportunity, slander and offend every group just because it is a group. A thriving world in which people can grow according to their own nature is not a world in which we feel the need to be very careful about preventing, about saying, about hearing offensive things. I mean, he's not looking at this primarily through a sociopolitical lens. From his point of view, we have to be offensive on purpose sometimes to prevent the social layer from doing what it always does, which is attempting to recapture and neutralize the power of the sacred. but it's complex. He said you should never try to undermine or replace the mythic soul of whatever people grew up in, because that connects them to land, to family, to their deep childhood subconscious, to the ways they first resonated with the sensitive seedlings of transformative capacity in themselves. But he also liked to irritate and joke and even obscenely play with and against the superficial social layer of conventional religious ideals and ideas. One of the phrases he loved was that if you want to lose your faith, make friends with a priest.
Well, I'll tell you, he sounds like a real character.
Exactly. I mean, part of what makes him not only so interesting as an alternative source and framing for spiritual development, but also an exemplar of a way that resecures your full humanity and helps it to blossom in a unique fashion, is the way that he epitomizes character. The work should make you into more of a character. It should educate and enliven the character that existed, at least in seed form, in your early childhood before you adapted to the dominant personality style through which you figured out how to live in the kind of civilization that we have.
So, did Gurdjieff really believe that we live on after death?
Again, yes or no answers would do him a great disservice. He spoke of additional bodies. Was that objective or metaphorical? I prefer to say that he was concerned to help certain kinds of people to evoke new modes of embodiment, and that the imaginal correlate of those forms of embodiment involve ways that our intelligence and capacities could be consolidated and uploaded into part of the self-regulatory and self-generative matrix of the cosmos. But he didn't let people off the hook about death. Even the subtle body dies in his vision. And for him, you cannot afford to believe that you will get to keep evolving in another life or in an afterlife. You need the intensity of immediacy. You have to get to work. And his really beautiful discussion of how he experienced the death of Orage, the famous avant garde publisher who became one of his best students and spiritual friends, he said, death is just that question which supersedes anything you can think about it. And that's a very Heideggerian sense of the full limit quality of death, from my point of view.
And, well, what would you say to people who say that Gurdjieff said that most people were just machines, sleeping robots, no better than fertilizer for the biosphere, and that only an elite few people can wake up and have souls?
That's sort of true, but it's not dismissive. It's like reading Nietzsche. You have to make sure you don't fall into the trap of associating conventional valences and adolescent dismissive concepts that are anchored in conventional terminology. For example, Gurdjieff loves fertilizer, loves manure. If he says someone is shit, he's not against them. We must accept that becoming fertilizer for the rest of the biosphere is, for all of us, our default mode and purpose and a highly praiseworthy destiny. But for people who are bothered by the way human beings behave, who see robotic and often bizarre unconscious aspects of their own being, those people through that discomfort have some other possibilities. They can undertake a work that has the phenomenological attribute of feeling that their subtle qualities are brought together into a coherent, unique whole team resonance. And I can tell you that this sort of a process has been very significant to the way that I relate to the feeling of death, but it would be either stupid or artistic to spin a yarn about the world beyond. And plus, a lot of that kind of summary of Gurdjieff terminology about machines and waking up comes more from Uspensky than from Gurdjieff's own work.
What do you make of Uspensky?
Oh, I love Uspensky. He was one of my main portals into this stuff, and from some positions, it's far too easy to critique and dismiss him. He was brilliant. He was spiritually maturing. His writing is dense and wise, and he really worked hard to transform his way of being in the world. But at the same time, Other less famous and less literate students didn't necessarily think Ouspensky was correctly understanding and describing Gurdjieff's teaching. And clearly, what's written in Gurdjieff's own books is very different in its content and its emphases, although with some obvious similarities from reading Ouspensky's books or from any kind of conventional work literature that is downstream from and strongly influenced by Ouspensky's phrasing and emphases. There's an emerging body of critique that treats the relationship between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff's framings as an entry point into the work. I get a lot from Ouspensky, but I do look back and feel that I was misled in some respects by the way he brilliantly and importantly phrased things.
Gurdjieff only has a couple of books. What are they and why did he write them?
That's a great question, or at least it's a question that turns me on a little. Gurdjieff has between 2 and 4 books. Everyone agrees about Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson and the quasi-autobiographical Meetings with Remarkable Men. A first book, The Herald of Coming Good, was withdrawn and denounced, which either makes you think you shouldn't read it or that you should definitely read it. And the last book, Life is Real Only Then When I Am, is either a mere fragment, or an introduction to a book he didn't write, or an introduction to a book he wrote and then destroyed, or its weird form is actually a complete book as intended, but deliberately structured and the hardest to extract from because it's the most experimental, containing esoteric secrets in their most elaborately cryptic form. So that's the set of writings. There's also a collection of things that he said early on called Views from the Real World. But those are his 2 to 4 personal texts when he thought he was trying to use language to communicate to human beings in the future in order to help them undertake the task that's possible for them. He was also very denigrating toward contemporary literature. He denounced writers as we have them now. But he also loved language. He played with words. He studied approaches to avant-garde writing, and he lived in the time of James Joyce and Ezra Pound. So after his car accident, when he, with many complaints, started writing, it was both a rupture with his man of action approach, but also a natural extension of his interests. He observed that he would probably not have the time or the helpers needed to fulfill the instantiation of his project for cultural and spiritual rejuvenation at a postmodern planetary scale. But many of his students, at the same time, he saw were incorrectly perceiving his teachings. They were, at the very least, getting the vibe wrong. He said he could see on their foreheads a stamp that read "Candidate for the Madhouse." They were instinctively misinterpreting his work in ways that amplified their neuroses instead of making them juicier, more unique, more creatively potent, spiritually experienced meta shamans with the existential contentment of beingness. Instead of that, they were becoming serious, self-conscious, hardship-obsessed throwbacks who didn't understand why he said a good, sturdy roadside thief might be more spiritual than they are, with all of their psychologized fantasies about suffering and purity and abstract consciousness.
This idea of suffering seems to come up a lot around Gurdjieff.
Yeah, that is an essential point in all of this. He said that intentional suffering was half of his whole dharma, half of being partkadol duty. But what is suffering, right? It's not homogeneous. Different modes of suffering have different results. Most of us put up with all kinds of shit that we should release or fix. We suffer stupidly. We can see that in others, but with ourselves, we're very identified with our typical miseries. Intentionality brings another element into this. If you lean into your typical forms of upset, you not only gain access to an intense, accelerated form of self-understanding, but you also make yourself available as like the integrating conduit between otherwise uncoordinated intelligence systems. So think about remorse. Remorse is a struggle. It's a friction between one inner system that says, here's what you did, and here's what you do, and another inner system that says, well, that's the opposite of my values. And usually we try to get rid of this emotive cognitive dissonance. But when you start wanting it, when you start looking for this, not just putting up with it, but wanting to be present at a nub of the existential disagreement in yourself, then you become the conductive filament, and a whole different kind of life starts to move in you in the form of the life you're already given.
What would you say are some examples of his practices?
Well, everything I've discussed here is practice. You dig for the principles and you convert the life you are living into practice like a fetus eating its placental nutrient. Right? Now, there are a few people who have compiled compendiums of practices that Gurdjieff either wrote in some of his books or gave in private exchanges with students. But it's important not to assume that these are generic practices for everyone. He is inventing them and adapting them to the needs of people as he perceives that need, and also trying to demonstrate the underlying principles. So it's not a these practices are not truths you can rapidly understand with your mind and then apply to yourselves. They are, at best, practices designed for someone in a particular circumstance and which illustrate principles you need to assimilate so that you can make sense of and generate practices for yourselves in your particular circumstances. And as you gain that capacity, you almost certainly need feedback from other people you trust and feedback from people who've done this a little more than you, so you can sort of figure out how to navigate that emerging skill set in yourself a little better.
Well, this has all been very interesting. Thank you for sitting down with me to confuse my sense of identity, I guess.
Anytime, my friend, my me, I think this sort of dialectical play between parts of ourselves that might initially appear to be our whole selves is essential. In alchemy, you have to break things apart in order to put them back together in a higher form. Solve et coagula.
I don't know what the hell that's supposed to mean, but where do people get this book?
This version of the book, and in all likelihood there will be little updates and changes before too long, I've found a few spelling errors already, is available online through any of Earth's finest evil supercorporations, and I hope that it conveys both Gurdjieff and something deeply personal about myself, and that it will reward rereading in different modes. Then we plan to have ebook versions, possibly an audiobook version in the future. But it's been wonderful talking to you, and if you'll excuse me, I have to go start growing my beard back, or no one will think I'm wise.